Okay, I'm going to introduce Marcy, who is a dear friend that I've known since 9th grade. She moved across the street from me as we were going into 9th grade, and we were friends since then. And she then introduced me to all of her friends from her old school, and we all became a big group together and had lots of fun and raised hell. Then we moved on to into different worlds, and Marcy's in California, and try to see each other when we have reunions. And so I'll tell you a little bit about what she's been doing. She is the executive director. Can everybody hear me? Just yeah,
You're good.
Executive director of the Center for Genetics and Society, which was founded in September 2001 by Marcy and Richard Hayes. They had shared concerns about how new human biotechnologies were opening the door to genetically engineered futures without adequate mechanisms in place to inform the public, facilitate debate, and regulate these biotechnologies. In response, the two joined forces to create an organization to do just that, the Center for Genetics and Society. And CGS advocates for socially responsible uses and effective governance of emerging human biotechnologies. To take up this task, they focus on mobilizing scholars, social justice activists, scientists, and bioethicists to help shape public debate and policies on biotechnologies with a particular focus on reproductive rights, as well as LGBTQ, disability, and racial justice. Marcy speaks and writes widely on the politics of human biotechnology, focusing on their social justice and public interest implications. Her articles have appeared in the New York Times, Nature, The Guardian, Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, Harvard Law and Policy Review, Democracy, New Scientist, and I guess Ms. Magazine, as Mark pointed out. Is that what it was, Mark? She's appeared on dozens of television, radio, and online news shows and has been interviewed and cited in hundreds of news and magazine articles. She's worked as an organizer and advocate in a range of environmental and progressive political movements and taught courses at Sonoma State University and at California State University, East Bay. Her PhD is from the History of Consciousness program at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And I guess with that, I'll let Marcy, over the years, I'll be turning on NPR and I'll hear Marcy being interviewed. It's always a surprise. So you never know, you may hear her sometime on the radio. But tonight we're going to hear her here. So take it away.
Natalie, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for inviting me to share this information with you, to share this Shabbat with you. I'm really happy to be here. And I wish I was with you physically in Cleveland, but that will have to wait. So I'm going to share my screen and let's see, I'm going to take you through a slideshow that I'll speak for about 35 minutes or so, and then we should have another 25 minutes for questions and discussion, if I understand your schedule right. Natalie's already told you about the Center for Genetics and Society. So I'm going to skip over telling you about the Center for Genetics and Society since Natalie already really covered the basics. And I want to start with this man, and his name is He Jiankui. You may recognize him. Until recently, he was a biology professor in Shenzhen, China, and the founder of several biotech companies. But he made headlines in November of 2018 when he announced something very startling. And he did this at a very high-profile conference in Hong Kong called the Second International Summit on Human Genome Editing. And what he told the assembled scientists, hundreds of them, and journalists there, was that he had used a powerful new genetic editing tool called CRISPR, which is often portrayed with these scissors cutting the DNA strand. And he had used this tool on human embryos that he then had overseen those embryos being transferred into a woman's uterus, and they developed into the world's first genetically modified babies, twin girls that he said were called Bulu and Nana. So how many people remember seeing news about that, headlines about that? Just, yeah, if you raise your hand. Yeah, it was really all over the world, considered big news. And just so to be clear that we all know what we're talking about here, the terms that are used to describe Lulu and Nana are often CRISPR babies or designer babies. Those are the media terms a lot. And they refer to a child who would develop from an embryo, from sperm or from eggs that had been genetically modified, whether by CRISPR or some other genetic engineering technique. And of course, when the gene modification is done at that stage, whatever changes are made are reflected in every cell of the resulting child's body. And if that child has his or her own children, those changes are passed down through the generations. And one of the technical terms for that is human germline modification. Another is heritable genome editing. So I'll use those terms interchangeably. So as I said, this made headlines, and some of the illustrations of it, just to give you a little flavor. Here's this baby with a startling glowing green eyes. And here's one with a glowing yellow golden brain. And I'm just showing these to you now for a little flavor, but we're going to come back later and talk about what these kinds of images say about the cultural imagination about what would happen if we were to allow heritable genome editing to be used, and the social implications of that. And that really is the main concern, my main concern, and the main concern of a lot of people. So I want to start, though, really by giving you a little bit of historical context for this debate, because it's not a new debate. But just before that, I want to just really emphasize a key distinction in this controversy, and that is the controversy that I tried to reflect in the title of the talk between using gene editing to treat patients on the one hand, or to alter human embryos on the other hand. So when you use gene editing to treat patients, that's sometimes called somatic editing. It's because the body cells, the somatic cells, are the ones that are changed. And that kind of gene editing targets specific tissues or cells in the body of a person who has a problem, who's sick. And those changes stay with that person. They don't get passed down through the future generations. And that kind of gene editing is, I think, and most people think, very, very promising, although it's been promising for many decades, and there have been some really tragic failures and deaths in the clinical trials. But in recent years, there are really quite promising successes. And if it can be made safe and effective, that would be wonderful. It does raise some, ethical concerns, and in particular, the concern about how much it costs. The treatment costs right now are in the $1 to $2 million range, so obviously something is going to have to give. But those are kind of familiar ethical questions about access and accessibility and fairness and distribution. On the other hand, the issues raised by altering embryos, germline modification, are sort of different kinds. They force us to think about the consequences of widespread use. What would happen to our society? What would our future look like if we were to allow parents to really design their children? So that key distinction, I think you can't understand conversations about human gene editing unless you understand that distinction. And I'm always dismayed when I see that distinction being muddied or blurred in news articles or conversations. And even now, it often is blurred. So I wanted to really emphasize that before moving on. So I said I was going to start with some history, and really this conversation's been going on for many decades, and you could start in the 1960s. I'm going to start here for this talk in the late 1990s. that was a time when we had just experienced the birth of the first cloned mammal. You might remember Dolly, the cloned sheep. It was also the time when scientists were doing the work that led up to the announcement in the year 2000 that the human genome had been mapped. And in those years, the late 1990s, there was a small group of people, including some very eminent scientists, who decided that they wanted to sort of make a push to make the idea of human germline modification publicly acceptable. And one of the things they did was to hold a big conference at UCLA in 1998. And it was called Engineering the Human Germline. And the book that you see on the left of the screen there came out of that conference. And the book on the right was written by one of the organizers of that conference. And their idea was that this is redesigning humans was inevitable, as the subtitle of the book says, and that their job was to assuage any concerns about it and make people like the idea. And they had 1,000 people at this conference. It was covered in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And they continued to really push this idea. This was also around the same time that people were starting to think, oh, maybe this isn't such a dandy idea. And I think probably many of you saw or remember seeing this movie called Gattaca, which portrays a future in the not too distant, not too long from now, where people are divided at birth between those who have been genetically enhanced and those who have not. And in the Gattaca world, they're called invalids and valids. This movie has become kind of a cult classic, and it's really worth watching. There's a lot of interesting and controversial things it has to say about disability and about our human future. So let's see. Also at this time, these ideas started circulating in the popular media. So these images are from the early 2000s, Time and Newsweek. And this book, Remaking Eden, How Genetic Engineering and Cloning Will Transform the American Family, was first published in 1998 by a Princeton molecular biologist named Lee Silver. And he wrote, in this book, he hypothesized and speculated about what the future would look like. And one of the things he said is on the left there. He said eventually the GenRich class and the natural class, that is those who have been genetically enhanced and those who have not, will become entirely separate species with no ability to crossbreed. And Professor Silver saw this not really as a warning. He saw it as a description of our inevitable future. And this was the book that actually set me on the course that led to the Center for Genetics and Society and led to my being here with you this evening. And I think, I'm pretty sure it was my Jewish upbringing that made me see this vision, Lee Silver's vision, as a new kind of eugenics. So I was a child in the 1950s and 1960s growing up in Cleveland. And you know, that was a time, I think all you remember, it was a time when American Jews were coming to grips with what happened in the Holocaust, and those shadows were really there and kind of taking shape. And I'm not sure when I first learned the word eugenics, but I know that it was in part my early awareness of what happened in the Holocaust that has really attuned me to any justifications of inequality or discrimination that are based in supposed biological differences between people. And I should say that Lee Silver himself is Jewish, but you know, has a very different view of things than I do. And he became a sort of spokesperson for the idea that we should go ahead and modify our children's genes and traits. So when Time magazine published a Turn of the Millennium issue in the year 2000, they asked Lee Silver to write ad copy for a fertility clinic of the future that was going to be offering this procedure. And here's what he wrote: "You must act before you get pregnant. Don't be sorry after she's born. This really is a once in a lifetime opportunity for your child to be. So, that's what I think is actually, as much as I disagree with Lee Silver, I think that he is prescient, and that if we were to allow heritable genome editing, this is what we would start to see. So also, we're still back in the 90s here. There were some countries where this prospect got taken very seriously, and it got discussed with a great deal of concern, including by legislatures of many countries. And what you see here is the actual language of an international treaty that was adopted by the Council of Europe. And it's called the Council of Europe Treaty on Biomedicine and Human Rights. The Oviedo Convention is what it's referred to often, because Oviedo is the town in Spain where it was discussed and finally adopted. And it entered into force in 1999. At this point, it's been signed and ratified by 29 European nations. And it's really a very clear statement that we should use gene editing to treat patients, but not to design babies. And it's very odd that this important treaty often goes unmentioned in conversations today about heritable genome editing, even though it has the force of law in all the countries that have signed and ratified it. And recently, the Council of Europe actually met and reaffirmed its provisions on heritable genome editing. So that's it for the 1990s. But one of the reasons I wanted to take you back here was that this is really where the kind of basic terms of the debate got formed. And it's not that different today. And so I'm going to walk you through what are the terms of the debate. What's the argument? The argument for heritable gene editing is basically we can use it to prevent the births of children who are affected by genetic conditions, which sounds compelling. And I'm going to tell you why I think that is not really as compelling as it sounds. And there's, as a shorthand, there's 4 categories of concerns. One is about safety. One is about whether it is actually medically needed for the reasons that its proponents say it is. The third is the societal concerns that using this technology for enhancement purposes would worsen inequality and discrimination. And finally, there's a policy question about who makes this decision? How is it made? So first, a few words about safety. Mostly the concerns are about safety for resulting children. And there are many risks. There are risks that we know about, that the CRISPR technology or any gene editing technology can change genes off target, not the gene that they're trying to affect, but somewhere else in the genome. There can be problems if the gene editing happens at the targeted site, but the particular change that was intended, that's not what happened, something else happened. And another concern is that some cells in an embryo will be modified and others not. That's called mosaicism, mosaic embryos, and that can cause problems later on. So in addition to those kinds of risks, there are many, many risks associated with the fact that we just really are in a way beginning our understanding of the complicated human genome and the developmental and interactions between genes and other environmental and biological dynamics that are going on. I mean, when you're doing gene editing to an early embryo, you're doing it at a moment when there's going to be this cascade of development that's very, very complex and very imperfectly understood. And then there's the question about what counts as safe? What's safe enough? And is it just that the child is born alive, born well? What happens later on in childhood, in adult life, and in later generations? And are there any problems, risks for the women who carry these modified embryos? So that's a really quick summary of the safety concerns. Then this is a really important one. Is this really a way to prevent people who are at risk for passing on a serious genetic condition to do that? And, this is a goal that this is an issue that I think maybe has particular resonance for people for Jews of Ashkenazi descent because of shared ancestry and population bottlenecks. Ashkenazi Jews carry a number of serious genetic disorders at a higher rate than the population at large. And so I think there's a special concern in the Ashkenazi Jewish community about genetic conditions. But here's the thing. In order to prevent passing on serious genetic conditions, there's no need to be messing around with the genes of one's future children, because you can already avoid the transmission by any of several safe and well-established techniques. So first of all, you could, anyone who knows they're at risk of passing on a genetic condition can use donated egg or sperm to avoid that 100% of the time. But for many people, it's important that their child not just be unaffected by a condition they know they're at risk of passing on, but that their child also be genetically related to both people in a heterosexual couple. And in that category, you can use this embryo screening technology called PGD, which stands for pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And what that means is that embryos are created through in vitro fertilization, and they can be examined, and only embryos that are not affected by the condition that's in question would be used to establish a pregnancy. And this would work for the overwhelming majority, 99.999% of people who are at risk of transmitting a genetic condition. And it really makes the argument, it really kind of takes the rug out from under the argument that that heritable genome editing is a good way to avoid genetic disease in newborn children. So there are some people who acknowledge this. They say, okay, but maybe there's still a few people who would prefer to use it, or can't create enough embryos so that they can get one. And yeah, it's just going to be a few people, but let's let them use it, and let's allow heritable genome editing for those kind of therapeutic purposes, but prohibit it for enhancement purposes. So we won't have to worry about designer babies. And the question there is this a distinction that could hold logically and conceptually? Because the line between what counts as a therapy and what counts as enhancement is inherently a very blurry line. So it would be difficult to make that conceptual distinction. Maybe you could draw up lists or something like that. But there you have to look at the real world of policy and how these kinds of rules are enforced. And in fact, the situation is in many countries, maybe most countries, and certainly in the United States, once any medical approach, a drug, a device, a procedure, once approved, it can be used for anything. So, you know, we talk about off-label uses of drugs, and there could be, if a heritable genome editing was approved, off-label uses of it, determined by a fertility doctor or your general practitioner, your OBGYN. So the regulatory authorities, the FDA in this country, can't reach post-approval to make any kinds of distinctions at all. So those who say that we could draw that line in policy have really not given a good explanation of how they would do that. And then you have to think about, well, what would be the societal consequences of allowing heritable genome editing? What would be the effects on people with disabilities and other marginalized populations? So if we were going to eliminate everything that counts as a disability, what would we be saying to people who are living perfectly fine lives, even though they have a disability? And I think we have to think really carefully about how the commercial dynamics would play out. And Lee Silver's marketing language for the fertility clinics, I think, gives a taste of that, of how people would feel pressure to give their children the best start in lives. And whether or not those biologically modified children actually were enhanced, actually were superior to anybody else, their parents would have invested a lot of money in these procedures they would be seen as enhanced. They would be seen as superior. And I think that from that, a lot of really pernicious consequences could follow, even up to a new era of high-tech eugenics and a world of genetic haves and have-nots. So that's kind of the way the argument goes. And as I said, it kind of built up to a high pitch around the turn of the millennium. Then in the 2000s, it simmered down a little bit. It was still there, but not as engaged. And but it became really it became very controversial and hot again in the 2010s. And that was in large part because of the development of CRISPR. And so just I'll take a pause here to give a very oversimplified explanation of what is CRISPR. And I was looking for something easy and friendly and came across a YouTube video from that Wired magazine put together, and you can find it on YouTube. It's called CRISPR Gene Editing Explained. And so CRISPR is derived from a naturally occurring molecular system in bacteria, and scientists have harnessed it. And it's often called gene editing because it's like metaphorically, it works like a search and replace. And like other metaphors, that search and replace, or, like word processing, editing, it really oversimplifies it and hides some of the problems, but it does have good explanatory power. And I chose this one because it's so familiar, and at the risk of making it, too domesticated and too benign, this is how Wired explained it. So they said, imagine that a toy train track is like your DNA. And there's a bit of genetic code that scientists want to swap out. So they design a short sequence of DNA code, and they call this guide RNA. And it matches the bit of the genetic code that they want to replace. And they attach the guide RNA to a protein, and that's going to be the little train, toy train. And they load that molecular tool onto the toy train. The toy train roams around the nucleus of the cell looking for the place in the genome that matches the guide RNA that it has on as its load. And once it finds a match, and then somewhere a scissors appears as part of that molecular tool. It cuts the DNA, and it can get rid of a problematic piece of the code. Also, the toy train could be carrying a replacement piece of the code and insert that in. And the cell's naturally occurring DNA repair mechanisms come into play here. And if everything goes well, it brings the two cut ends together with the new genetic code in it. So that is really a simplified version of it, but it gives you a little bit of idea of how it works. As soon as CRISPR was announced, people started speculating about what it would be used on. It can be used in any organism, plant, animal. And people started wondering if anyone would use it on human embryos. And in fact, in 2015, that is what happened. It was announced in some scientific studies that some scientists had done this, and it immediately evoked very disparate views among scientists as well as among other sorts of people. But just to illustrate, in March 2015, a group of scientists wrote in Nature an article called "Don't Edit the Human Germline." Pretty blunt. And they said that there are serious risks, and the therapeutic benefits are tenuous, and this is a path toward enhancement. So that's basically the argument that I stepped you through a moment ago. Another group of scientists a month later wrote in Science that they supported a prudent path forward for genomic engineering and germline editing, germline gene modifications. So that group of scientists has really kind of come to the fore, but there are prominent scientists, including this man, Eric Lander, who maintain their skepticism and opposition to going forward with heritable genome editing. And one of the things that I really appreciate about Eric Lander is that even though he is a scientist, a very eminent one, he really talks about the social and policy concerns. And he wrote back in 2015 in an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, an article where he asked, would the best genomes go to the most privileged? And he said, if we cross this threshold, it's hard to see how we could ever return. And many of you may have read that Eric Lander was recently appointed by President Biden to head up the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And President Biden actually elevated that position to cabinet level, which I think, is a really good sign for us, people who want science, responsible science, to move forward. So let's see. Okay, now we're in 2015, and I wanted to just really quickly show you some of the images that accompanied the announcement that human embryos had been edited. So this one from MIT Technology Review, now we can engineer the human race. This is from The Economist, Editing Humanity, and you can see they are pointing to all the traits that could be modified, IQ, baldness, perfect pitch, and so on, with this new tool, the prospect of genetic enhancement. British magazine, The Spectator, used the E word, eugenics, and said researchers don't like the word, but they're running ahead with the idea. And Britain is at the forefront. So this is becoming a sort of a nationalistic thing as well. Time magazine says you can imagine rogue IVF clinics offering services guaranteeing offspring that will have this trait or that trait. And finally, this one from Cosmos, Build Your Own Baby. So one of the reasons I wanted to show you these images was to point out, if you haven't noticed it, that these babies all share something. They all have fair skin, blonde hair, blue eyes. And I think we have to take notice of that is what the cultural imagination of a designer baby is. We also have to acknowledge that the genetic components, even of things like hair color, eye color, and skin color, are very complicated. And, that's only more true of traits like intelligence or athleticism. And really, nobody believes that you can get a high IQ baby or a Stephen Curry baby by tweaking a few genes. But that has not stopped scientists, some scientists who are on the more techno-enthusiastic side of things, from publicizing lists of genes that they foresee targeting. And I think that reality would also be unlikely to stop those fertility clinics from being persuasive, and that, again, just the perception that gene-edited kids would be superior would jumpstart the market. So with all this going on, it was unclear. It was clear in 2015 after this announcement that something had to be done. There had to be a policy process, and the National Academies of Sciences kind of stepped up and took on that challenge. They held this big, huge three-day, 500-person meeting in Washington, D.C. in December of 2015, International Summit on Human Gene Editing. And they invited dozens of speakers. And in this particular meeting, there were a number of speakers who were non-scientists, humanists, social scientists, philosophers, bioethicists, lawyers. And I was actually invited to speak at it. And I was very honored to be invited, but I was the sole person representing a public interest group, the only one. At the conclusion of this meeting, the organizers issued a statement, and they said, well, we're not going to use germline editing right now. We have to first do two things. One, we have to make sure that the relevant safety and efficacy issues have been resolved. And the second, they said, is that no one should do it until there is broad societal consensus about whether it's appropriate or not to do it. And that was such a welcome statement. It was such a promising commitment. But the sad truth is that since 2015, the proponents of human gene editing, including the people at the National Academies of Sciences, have been furiously backpedaling on that commitment to broad societal consensus. And no one has really provided the, material support for the hard work that anything resembling broad societal consensus would require. So, so it's left to, small public interest groups like the Center for Genetics and Society to try to organize some of that process, some of the conversation that includes voices that are typically not sought and not heard. And so we've organized conversations that center on heritable gene editing and disability rights and justice, on reproductive rights and justice, on human rights, and on environmental justice. So we had this wonderful event with Bill McKibben and John Powell. And, we just think that it's so important if you're going to talk about public participation, and if really you're going to talk about democratic governance, you have to hear from people. And, I feel confident that if people listen to the arguments and then they grapple with them, that they will conclude, as I have, that, this is a technology we don't need and the societal risks are too great. But I feel very open to the process, and really we have worked so hard to get that commitment to broad societal consensus honored. So this brings us up to almost the current time, back where we started with He Jiankui announcing Lulu and Nana's birth at the 2018 summit, also organized by the National Academies of Sciences. And the funny thing was that this researcher believed that he would be acclaimed and celebrated. He actually thought he would win a Nobel Prize for what he did, but instead he was widely, universally really criticized and condemned, including by the organizers of the summit. So here you have David Baltimore, the Nobel laureate, who is the organizer of these conferences. But the funny thing is he and others in the National Academies of Sciences, they joined in the criticism of He Jiankui and what he had done, and they called him a rogue scientist. But then they made this funny pivot and they said, we're going to do it. We're going to do it right. And it's time to define a rigorous, responsible translational pathway towards clinical trials of heritable genome editing. So they defined this as a bad apple, but we're the good apples and we're going to go forward with this. Again, there were many scientists who differed. Adopt a Moratorium on Heritable Genome Editing was published shortly after that. And there were many scientific leaders who called for a global moratorium. And interestingly, also the startup biotech companies that are trying to create gene therapies using CRISPR, they have publicly pledged not to use it for germline gene editing. The Chinese government cracked down as well, and they sentenced He Jiankui to 3 years in prison for what he had done. And the news has continued to come out. So less than a year ago, a series of experiments were done that showed that actually the use of CRISPR in human embryos isn't straightforward. The safety issues remain very concerning. And I think this headline kind of captures it. Chromosomal mayhem is what it says. And yet the National Academies continue to support moving forward. They put out this report last September where they recommend going ahead and what the criteria should be for clinical trials of heritable human genome editing. And then this controversy remained in the news, even throughout the pandemic. These various things happened, including the announcement in October last year that 2 of the scientists who developed CRISPR had won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for it. And that's amazing. And the fact that they were women scientists getting this honor was really a wonderful thing. And interestingly, Jennifer Doudna, who has really become sort of a person that is gotten a lot of media spotlight, she's pretty much on the side of moving ahead. Emmanuelle Charpentier, on the other hand, with whom she shared the prize, is very clear that it shouldn't happen. So even among the 2 scientists who got the Nobel Prize, there's this difference. then you may have seen this book that came out just last month. Walter Isaacson, the biographer, wrote a biographer of Jennifer Doudna. This book has gotten a lot of attention, many, many reviews, many interviews. It's a page turner, but I think it's much too celebratory of the idea of heritable genome editing. And we've got a great review of it on our website that I think is worth reading. One last word before we turn to conversation, which is what are the laws? I told you about the Council of Europe Treaty, but we were struck by the fact that in all these reports and controversies and articles and so on, there's this assumption that often, very frequently actually, where the way that the current policy landscape is portrayed is some countries, a few countries prohibit. In fact, we knew that there were a lot more than a few, because we knew that there were the 29 countries that had signed the Oviedo Convention. And we undertook this survey, and it was a slog. It took us 2 years. We looked at the laws of 100 countries. And what we learned was that 70 of them actually prohibit heritable genome editing already. So the idea that is even in the National Academy's most recent report that international cooperation on this issue is not, that will never happen. Why not? 70 countries already agreed to it. And it seems to me that it makes international cooperation quite feasible. So this all does raise the question of who decides and how does that decision get made? And just, I think one of the things we need to start with is not, we need to ask whether we should be doing this. Do we want to go there? And not what the National Academies is doing, which is saying, how do we get there? What's the pathway? That seems like it's putting the cart before the horse and not knowing where the cart or the horse is going. And I think that it really is important to affirm the idea that since this is a decision that has consequences for all of us, it is not a decision that scientists alone can make. So that's really the message. That's where the conversation is right now. And it's a conversation that we're trying to keep going in all venues possible, including, I'm so happy to be here with you tonight to talk about it more.
Thank you. That was great, Marcy.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I'm not sure how the Q&A should work, but I'd be happy if people just spoke up.
Natalie, do you want to call on people?
Sure. Did anyone put things in the chat?
I saw one.
Yeah, why don't we put it in the chat? Why don't we put all the Q&A in the chat? That might be.
Yeah. Lynn's first question says, that was wonderful, great slides. She wants to know, and actually I had the same question, is there anything known about the twin girls born in China? I'm curious too.
Yeah, I think that is a good question. The researcher who oversaw their births actually showed the genetic sequences that he had created from their genes after they were born. And it turned out that when those were analyzed, one of the girls had that condition called mosaicism. That is, some of the cells in the embryo had been modified and others had not. And no one knows what the consequences of that will be. And the children have, maybe because of privacy reasons, which are good reasons,
Right.
the children have not been examined, or if they have been examined by any other researchers or medical people, that has not been
Nothing
publicized.
public. Mhm.
So we don't really know. We have no idea what
Right.
what the health consequences are.
Interesting. Okay. Let's see. Next, let's see. Arnie has two things. Did you want to ask two questions, Arnie?
Little comments, yeah, I think it will help. Thank you again, Marcy, for sharing with us. It's very interesting there. You struck a chord with me early on when you said growing up in the 1950s and 60s, very similar to my life, and the awareness of, well, my stories were Hitler trying to change the color of eyes of the children from brown to blue, Dr. Death and all that stuff. So I grew up with the idea of, yeah, we can't let that happen. So that's kind of tempered a lot what I've been thinking about. And then second off, this development of where we should go with all this sounds like the development of the A-bomb. You had your Society of Concerned Scientists, all that, and then you had those who are moving forward. It seems to me it's it's a parallel world, both very perilous in a way.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. And, you know, I don't know what lessons to draw from that. We've thought about that. And on the one hand, you know, you can say that we have these sporadic articles from scientists who are making it very clear that they see the dangers and the likely pernicious societal consequences of allowing there to be two species of human beings eventually, or possibly. But we don't have a bulletin of the atomic scientists analogy at this point for heritable genome editing. And, you know, another comparison that I think is one that gives some hope is that once nuclear science got going, there was this enormous investment in the defense sector. And then once these discoveries were going to be used for nuclear power in the energy sector. So lots and lots of money got mobilized behind and to push these nuclear technologies forward. That has not happened as of yet for heritable genome editing. As I said, the startup companies that are working on gene therapies and the companies that are working on using CRISPR for genetically modified food organisms, which was a whole different issue, they don't want to be associated with the idea of designed babies, genetically engineered babies. They want to keep their distance from it. And they've been vocal in saying that. So that, as of now, that, you know, we still have that window where there's not a lot of money behind it.
That's good. Okay, Spike is wondering if there's a relationship between CRISPR and the COVID vaccines, which used RNA in some way.
You know, yeah, it makes sense to think that, but there's really not. The RNA vaccines don't change any genes at all. So that was a concern that a lot of people had when it first got announced that the COVID vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines were these mRNA vaccines, but they do not change anybody's genes.
Let's see, Nora, I think Nora's is a comment. I don't know, it just says, this was a fascinating talk. It really mirrors the issue of how technology moves faster than our ability to handle it. For example, social media, you know, is that good or bad? So.
Yeah, well, I think in a lot of these questions, it's, you know, there are distinctions that you have to make. And so, you know, I'm not saying that gene editing is bad in any sense. It's, you know, particular applications of it, the particular application of using it in an effort to control the genes and traits of future children, I think should be off limits. But to use it for therapies, for medical treatments for people who are sick, yes, you know, we really want to support scientists to do that and to make those treatments available and affordable for people.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Greg and Karen are asking, how do you feel about the use of this technology in animals, such as cows or chickens or goats or whatever?
Right. Well, I should say that organizationally, we don't take positions on genetically modified plants or animals, agricultural crops. I think that there's a really interesting set of concerns there about genetically modified food. And some of them have nothing to do with safety, but rather have to do with the livelihoods of, you know, farmers in developing nations and that kind of thing. So, and environmental consequences. So I do think that there's a need for careful consideration and really effective oversight and regulation of these kinds of emerging technologies. But, you know, I've been concerned for a long time, not just with human gene editing, but with other technologies too, and how they kind of escape. This goes back to the last to Nora's comment, that we don't really have good policy mechanisms or sort of good democratic habits of how we would control the shape of these powerful new technologies. And they really shape our lives. They shape our lives often more than a tax policy, an education policy, and in many cases, you know, who's the mayor, who's the governor, who's the president even, you know. So they're very important in determining how we live, who thrives, who benefits, who pays, who's harmed. And yet they somehow escape our any kind of democratic governance. So I think these all have to be subject to much greater scrutiny, and we have to get better at understanding how to think about them, how to assess them, and how to regulate them.
Good point. All right, let's see. Can you comment, Spike again, can you comment on the genetic themes in the superhero combo? You can see these, okay. Do you want me to read it or you see it?
I think, can everyone see the chat?
Oh, maybe everybody. Okay, thinking about it, the X-Men and Captain America, the super soldier explore these ideas.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, I have tried to think about that. And one thing I've noticed in a lot of these stories about superheroes is that there's always this backstory, or there's often, I should say, this backstory where the superpowers were bequeathed upon this person by some, you know, villain, someone who wants to control the universe, you know. And so that's seen as a bad thing. But on the other hand, the superhero is like amazing. They can fly, they can have X-ray vision. And so you want to be like them, or you want your girlfriend or boyfriend to be like them, you know? So it's this contradictory theme that I've seen played out over and over in those kind of superhero things. But I'd like to hear what other people think about this and the other questions too. Maybe in the time we have left, we can have more of a conversation.
It should have been down here.
I put the next one up. It says from me to everyone, but me is Dorothy.
Okay, I see your name, Dorothy. It says,
Oh,
I
okay.
think that it is just too early at this time. Once there is more done with curing illnesses, then some people will be ready to start
It's gonna happen.
designing babies for a price.
It's gonna happen.
Well, I hope
Motive.
that won't happen.
Well, I think it will.
I think it's
because the profit
inevitable.
motive is too delicious to
Yeah,
some people,
yeah,
and they will not be thinking, and then people will be willing to pay to have a brilliant child or a blue-eyed child or whatever, whatever they like. People will be willing to pay for that, but I think it's just a little premature.
I hope
That's-
so.
I think that because people are they're unscrupulous.
Yeah.
That
well, that's why I think
human nature.
that's why I think we do need to just say this is just off limits. You can't do it.
Yeah,
Against the
I
law.
agree. I agree. But because it's
Go ahead.
The next one is from Mark. What sort of life did Dolly have? Do you know?
What sort of?
Life did Dolly, the modified
Oh.
sheep, have? Do we
Yeah,
know?
Dolly the cloned sheep. Yeah, that was. She died at the age of, I think, 6 or 7.
I remember when she died, but I
Yeah.
don't know anything. Yeah.
And I don't know that they were ever able to determine whether that age was premature death for a sheep, or whether the fact that she was a cloned animal had anything to do with it or not.
Yeah.
But what became clear in the years after they cloned the first mammal and astonished everybody that they could do it was that it's a very fraught and inefficient is the term that is the sort of clinical term that's used to describe the reproductive cloning process, because you need to have Dolly herself, it took hundreds of embryos. They had to create hundreds of embryos, and all of them either didn't develop or started to develop, and the fetus was miscarried. Some of them came to term but died either shortly before or shortly after birth. And that turned out to be true across species, even though there were very large species differences in how difficult it was to get the cloning to work. In all the species, there's this problem that it takes, it takes all these eggs and embryos to do it. And presumably no one was going to do those experiments on human beings. So
Yeah.
I hope that is the case.
Yeah, not real efficient. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Kathy and Jim Mayer want to know, plant and animal use of CRISPR speeds the breeding used for many years.
Mhm.
This will give confidence for human use. Comment.
Well, I think some scientists do take some confidence from that. And I think what is being discovered now is that even in the gene therapy uses, it's more complicated than was thought or was hoped by a lot of people. And with there was actually just another study that came out last week or the week before, where some of the experiments using CRISPR on human embryos were reanalyzed. And what this researcher in the UK discovered, Kathy Nyakin, was that if you look more carefully, you see more problems. And, one of the comments on that was, this should really be a full stop on efforts to CRISPR human embryos. That from a gene editing scientist who said, this isn't just cold water, this is like an ice flow on the idea of using CRISPR on human gene editing. But some people don't think that. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, let's see. Amy Kinslinger is saying, I'm intrigued with the rogue scientist. Is there a consensus that there may be others out there?
And another thing, Marcy, this is Bob. How are you? I hit the wrong button. I wanted to ask also, is there a feeling that there are other countries out there, even though they say they're against it, that they are sponsoring some of these scientists to go ahead with their work?
I think that actually, the country that I think, if someone is going to think there's a country that's sponsoring this, it would be China. And in fact, when He Jiankui made his announcement, it took about 24 hours for the other Chinese scientists and the Chinese government to react. But when they saw that there was this universal condemnation, they followed suit. They did, sentence him to prison for what he did and strip him of his funds and so on. And they've been actually jointly working with the National Academies and the Royal Society on these summits. And I think this is a sphere in which they clearly are investing a lot of money in all things genetics, including human genetics. But they also want to be seen as, in cooperation with the rest of the world on this area. And in fact, I think we really try to resist the idea that there's this that there should be this nationalistic competition. And this is an area where, like with COVID vaccines, we really, really need international cooperation. Because if we don't have that, what we're going to get is a race to the bottom. And we're going to get people traveling across borders to take advantage of things that are illegal in their own countries or lower priced or whatever. And I think it's going to cause a lot of problems. And the last thing I'll say about that is that, He Jiankui spent a lot of time in the United States as a student and in his post-student days, and he worked with American scientists, and it came out in the aftermath of this bombshell announcement that he had been in touch with a number of scientists who knew what he was doing, and bioethicists as well. And some of them said, well, you know, we told him he shouldn't do it, and we didn't know who to tell. And it was also pretty clear that some of them had encouraged him. So when there was, you know, I mean, there's lots to be criticized about the Chinese government, its record on human rights. I mean, really a lot to be criticized, worker rights and so on. But I don't think, I think in assessing the different countries' responsible conduct in terms of heritable genome editing, we should look at other countries, but also look in the mirror.
Okay. Enid mentioned that for treating Huntington's, or I think she's referring to sickle cell anemia, you know, that would be wonderful if those could be treated. But that is what you've been saying for diseases, sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, one of the great things about sickle cell is that because it's a blood disorder, that means, you know, you can remove blood, you can do the work outside the body. You can see if you got it right, and then put the genetically modified blood back into the patient.
Huh.
And so there have been
Done?
some really promising trials on sickle cell. There's a patient, yeah, who actually has been treated and has had no sickle cell episodes since then, and her blood looks really good. So it's truly, truly exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Okay.
Did that treatment for sickle cell come after CRISPR or before?
No, it's a CRISPR-based treatment.
Interesting. Okay.
I think it's a matter of time. I put something up there because I wrote, think about the fact that we have just flown a helicopter on another planet. So it seems to me this is just a matter of time. And I don't know if international laws will mean anything to people. I don't know how that goes, but I don't know how you can ban such a thing of designing babies, and you know, I don't have any idea how that would work, but I think that's what we should be working towards, because it's inevitable to me. I mean, just a short time ago, we didn't think we could go to Mars. Most people.
Yeah.
Now we're flying a plane on Mars.
Well, I think if we have the policies in place, then it discourages a lot of people. It keeps it from being marketed in a widespread way. And if there are people who are, you know, I don't know, setting up ships offshore to make designer babies, you crack down on them. You know, there are things in our society that we say, this is not okay, this is against the law, and doesn't mean nobody breaks the law, but we would live in a very different world if we didn't outlaw murder or rape. So yeah.
Okay, Arnie says, how far off are the Hollywood films concerning this?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, right. You mentioned the one, right?
Gattaca is really worth watching now. Yeah.
I guess so.
If I may add here, concerning misinformation, and like you said, if there's a consensus among people, that may be part of what moves this along. But is Hollywood portraying this real or not real? And are they gonna sway those who can't think for themselves, you know?
Well, there's really films, theater, books that point out, there's some that celebrate this and there's some that really are thoughtful and criticize it. I just read this wonderful novel by Kazuo Ishiguro about artificial intelligence, and it also has a theme about genetically uplifted, it's called in this book, and it's called Clara and the Sun. It's a really wonderful novel. And actually there's a play that's going to be performed live on Zoom, that if you go to our website, you can find out how to see it. They're going to do it on May 15th and May 16th, and it's called Perfect. And there's a number of others. I mean, Margaret Atwood has treated this theme in Oryx and Crake, and Kazuo Ishiguro also has an earlier book about cloning, Never Let Me Go. There's many others, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Okay,
and Spike mentioned the Ken Burns documentary
Right.
about genetics, which
Right.
that was the one that featured Spike Siddhartha Mukherjee pretty prominently, right?
I don't know if Spike,
I don't remember that part, but the Chinese scientist was in there and there was a lot of stuff about the history of genetics that was pretty good. And
Yeah.
treatment of the sickle cell. It covered pretty much like a really good cross-section of all the issues.
Uh-huh.
oh, good to know. Okay.
And that actually reminds me of Mark, who I think maybe had to get off, but he asked the question about
Right.
yeah, the
Right.
missing children. What reminded me is Siddhartha Mukherjee talks about this a lot, that sex selection, which, you know, most of which in the world is done with very low tech means.
Right.
Yeah.
Murder.
Or
Right.
abortion of girl fetuses, female fetuses. That's, you know, I mean, that's an interesting issue because it is a catastrophe in South Asia.
Right.
That there are these millions and millions of demographic imbalances between the sexes because of the selective abortion, mostly of girls. So what does that mean about sex selection for us here? You know, we think it's a matter of reproductive rights, and we're not going to tell, I'm not going to tell a woman, you know, not to terminate her pregnancy for any reason, but it can have these enormous societal consequences. And I think that the consequences that it's having to this day in China and India are kind of cautionary tales for us in thinking that we should be designing future generations.
Is the sex selection in Asia because of religious preference or political preference?
I would say cultural more than either religious or political.
Yeah. It's just more valuable, a male in those cultures.
But the culture is religion in the sense that the religion has been for 5,000 years or thereabouts. And I ask that with this thought in mind. Show me a political system that has lived longer than a religious system.
Okay.
I don't know how to answer that. Does anybody?
I don't think there is one. So now it's not politics, but perhaps it's religion that is the controlling societal aspect.
Hard to say.
I'll get back to you.
So there's one more comment from Bobby.
Yeah. Bobby says, and Mike, we're entering an era in which social justice and equity are at the forefront. What might happen when our social consciousness changes? What?
I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Bobby and Mike?
Yeah.
Garbles? Okay. Put on your mic.
I did. This is
Okay.
Bobby. Well, I have to admit that my mind was wandering a little to the last political situation, the 16 to 20 political situation, and thinking they would be hard pressed to find people who cared. Since money rules, that would have been a hard system to honor the social consciousness of the scientists and whoever else was speaking up, because the rest of the public wasn't speaking up, wasn't expressing their concerns and doubts. And I'm wondering if there are any political scientists among your group who may have pondered that situation. Right now, we can feel fairly safe in the social justice that the scientists, or at least your group, seems to be dealing with. But what if?
Well, that's a complicated question, and I'd love to hear other people's points of view about it too. You know, there were people who supported the last president who, I think, you know, for religious reasons would have been opposed to manipulating genes of future children, and they would certainly be opposed to messing around with human embryos and things like that. And there were others, including the president himself, who put a lot of stake in genes. And Donald Trump attributed his own intelligence and made statements also attributing the intelligence of his supporters to genetics. And he talked about the racehorse theory, where you breed people like you breed racehorses, is what he was saying. So I think, you know, just like among people on the Democratic side of things, people among the Republican side of things are divided on this issue. And that's one of the interesting things about it, actually. Scientists are divided, bioethicists are divided. So it's
but not necessarily in terms of social justice and equity. That's why I was specific.
Yeah,
about
that's an argument that I think that's true. It's made by people who consider themselves advocates of social justice, racial justice, disability justice. Yeah. What do other people think about that? The politics of this and how that will play out.
Apparently, I'm the only one who thinks about that.
Maybe I could add to it. I mean, with you know, all the immigration and all this, people now coming aware of, like, accept me as me, you know, whether I'm Black, Latino, anything, accept me as me now. And now they're going to say, what, change people to be this or be that? No, we don't want that. Who knows? It could go in that direction, because as the majority of the country is now becoming immigrants again, you could say, or refugees, or any word you want to use, they'll want to celebrate their own heritage, their own, just like the Jewish way we celebrate ourselves. So there might be an anti-whatever against, you know, designer babies. But yeah, if you could fix people on the spot, you know, with their specific disease and it doesn't get passed on, maybe that'll come about. I don't know, because there's a big movement now. It's not stopping. It's very good what's going on. I mean, we can all agree to that now with the consciousness, but you know.
Anybody else have any comments about the politics of this? Okay, quiet group tonight.
These are great questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Well, there's one more comment here in the chat box from Enid. Cultural practices, I think this is in relation to the thing about China and selective abortion. Cultural practices outlive both religion and politics. Boys carry on the family name, right?
Stop.
What's that?
No, go ahead.
That's all. Did you have something?
Yeah, but no, I finished your comment. I had a question. Edie was giving me advice.
We didn't mean to interrupt. We forgot we were not muted, so.
Oh, okay.
I apologize.
Did you have a comment though?
Yes, weren't you in the middle of saying
I thought you were in the
something?
middle of something.
No, I just was reading what Enid wrote, and it was about, it related to the selective abortion in Asia and the practice of aborting girls, and there's so many boys and it's a problem. But that's all. Enid just made a comment. That was all. It wasn't a question. But go ahead if you have something.
Yes.
Okay.
I proposed a course for Chautauqua last year, which they initially accepted, that ends up in the general ballpark of where we were tonight. There is a novel by a French writer, Michel Houellebecq, who is very controversial, but he's also very good. I tell people who've never read him, A, it's hard to tell women to read it. because of the way he seems to treat and describe women in the book. And generally, it's as though Philip Roth meets Marcel Proust. They have the most abysmal topics discussed in the most elegant fashion. And he is that good in French. And when the New York Times reviewed one of his recent books, they chose the Norwegian philosopher Knausgård to do the review. And Knausgård is currently the reigning eminence of European philosophy. So take him seriously as a general idea. Well, in 1997 in France, he published a novel that translates as The Elementary Particles, that are exactly about this subject. And he was writing in 1997 that genetic editing will progress so far that by around 2020, China will do experiments on human genetic editing for babies. And by 2027, there will be an international conference where a decision has to be made about whether to replace the human race with a new race of superior beings, much as we replaced the Neanderthals.
Oh, God.
And the vote is yay. And so off we go to the future, and the novel officially is set in around 2080, a couple of generations after the decision is made. And the scene of the novel officially is a banquet at which the new superiors are proposing a toast, a memorial to the defunct human race who created us.
Oh,
Have you read it, or do you know anything about it?
I do know of it, and it's been on my list of books to read, in my pile of books to read for a long time, and your summary of it makes me want to pop it up to the top.
I think given what you're doing, you need to boost it to the top.
Yeah.
So anyway.
What's the name again, Walker?
Admitted the same thing. He said that people ask him all the time, have you read The Elementary Particles by Welbeck? And he admitted he hadn't. But I think throughout Western Europe, they would regard it as the single great novel of the late 20th century.
Huh.
Who is the author again, Walker?
Oh, God. The name, he's of Flemish origin.
Spell it.
So it is pronounced Welbeck or Velbeck, but in French, it comes out as Houellebecq.
here.
And
HOU.
you can invent HOU.
Maybe type it.
I'll put it in the chat. I'll put it in the chat.
Put it in the chat. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
This issue has been really discussed by a lot of very prominent philosophers, novelists. The German Jürgen Habermas, who some of you might be familiar with, wrote a little book about it. And, again, among philosophers, there's the utilitarian philosophers who think this is fine and dandy, like Peter Singer. Then there's, the Habermasian approach, which is very, very different. So it's very controversial, and like tonight, when you open it up, people have a lot to say about it and have a lot of strong feelings about it. And I think it's because the social consequences that are possible are pretty extreme, and that we better damn well be careful with it. That's, I think, something that everyone should agree on.
I have a comment that is on a different theme. It relates to what Barbie Varble said about social justice, in the sense that I think it can also be a matter of the economics of social injustice, where even, like, let's say with IVF, the people who have that available to them are typically people who are more well-to-do. And then there's the racial component of who is well-to-do in our society. So that I can foresee with IVF, even if we're selecting, as you were saying in the beginning, for embryos that would be not carrying genetic disorders,
Like Down syndrome, for
then that
example.
would be more available to people who are of greater economic means. So that, you know, there's the social aspect of that. And for better or worse, if there were not a ban, well, for worse, if there were not a ban, in my opinion, if there were not a ban on using gene editing to selectively wean out, we'll call disabilities, say, then that would also be reflected economically and probably therefore racially.
Yep.
Yeah, you know, I think I didn't say and should have said in discussing the embryo selection technique that that's not an ethics-free procedure either. You know, I mean, it's power to reshape society, I think, is not as great as by a long shot as human gene editing. But when you think about it, what we're doing is we're saying we're going to decide, you know, who we're going to welcome in this world. And people with certain conditions, we're saying, should not be allowed in. They don't get the ticket.
Right.
So I think it's also a technology that needs careful thought. And I think, you know, as good genetic counselors will tell you, these are complicated decisions for people, and they get very personal because, you know, it's about what your family is going to, how your family is going to be. But we've had a lot of assumptions that people with disabilities either, you know, should, you know, they're defined by their disability only. They shouldn't be supported. And I think we have been challenged by the disability rights and justice advocates to really think about that. And is that the kind of world we want to live in?
The hard of hearing community has had a big say in that whole issue.
Exactly.
Marcy, have you read Types of Mankind?
What is that?
That's probably one of the foundation books of genetics, eugenics, of about almost 200 years ago, the 1830s, 40s. The works of Thomas George Morton, who proposed brain size as being the differentiator between the races of mankind. Blacks, Jews, American Indians, Mongolians, blah, 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 all coming from unique geographic territories and being classifiable by brain cavity. And who has the biggest brains? Western Europeans, whites.
That would make Neanderthals the winners, actually.
Yeah, but it turns out that we're just descendants of Neanderthals. They didn't die away, they left us.
They left us a little bit of their
That's
DNA.
very little bit.
Yeah.
Spike had to leave, so we're not going to do the breakout rooms. So if maybe in another 5 minutes or so, we'll end the meeting. So if anyone else has any questions or comments.
Great talk. Thank you so much, Marcy.
Yeah, very good.
Thanks,
Very
Marcy.
Are we done?
Thank you very, very
Very
much.
nice, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Carry on the good work.
okay, good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.